January 17th, 1944. 28,000 feet above the Adriatic Sea. The air at this altitude does not breathe. It cuts. Inside the cockpit of a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, Lieutenant James Harrington's fingers have gone numb despite his fleece-lined gloves. The twin Allison engines hum their mechanical prayer on either side of him, twin booms stretching like skeletal arms into the pale morning sky. Through the frosted plexiglass he can see nothing but endless blue ascending into black, the curvature of the earth itself becoming visible at this height where men were never meant to fly. His breath crystallizes instantly in the thin atmosphere, forming patterns of ice on his oxygen mask. He reaches forward to adjust the throttle and his hand trembles, not from fear, but from the cold that has seeped through every layer, through leather and wool and flesh, down into the bone itself. Below him, somewhere in that impossible distance, the war continues. But up here, in this frozen cathedral of rarefied air, Lieutenant Harrington fights a different enemy. His control surfaces are stiffening. The ailerons respond sluggishly to his inputs, as if the aircraft itself is succumbing to paralysis. Ice crystals form in intricate patterns across every metal surface, beautiful and deadly. He has been briefed about high-altitude interception missions, about the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance aircraft that operate at heights where conventional fighters struggle to function. But no briefing prepared him for this. The way the cold transforms his aircraft from a weapon into a coffin, the way his own body begins to shut down despite every technological safeguard the engineers have installed. What Lieutenant Harrington cannot see, what none of the pilots climbing into the stratosphere in the winter of 1944 can see, is the small modification that will soon transform everything. Hidden in the wings of the next generation of P-38s wrapped around fuel lines and control cables, running through cavities in the tail assembly, lies something so simple that German intelligence will initially dismiss it as American overcomplexity. It is wire, nothing more exotic than that, but wire that generates heat, wire that channels electrical current through resistance into warmth, wire that represents a shift in the fundamental philosophy of aerial combat. The Germans have built their high-altitude interceptors around the assumption that cold is an unavoidable constant, that any pilot willing to endure the suffering can dominate the frozen sky. The Americans, in their characteristic way, have decided that suffering is a problem to be engineered away. This is not merely a story about aviation technology. This is a story about two civilizations looking at the same problem and reaching opposite conclusions about the nature of human limitation. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning entered service in 1941 carrying the weight of American ambition on its distinctive twin-boom frame. It was unlike anything, flying in any Air Force, a radical departure from conventional single-engine fighter design, with its pilot positioned in a central nacelle between two engines, each driving a counter-rotating propeller. The configuration offered theoretical advantages: more power, more stability, more space for weapons and fuel. But theory and practice diverge at altitude, and by 1943, the P-38 had developed a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. In the Pacific Theater, where battles raged at medium and low altitudes over tropical oceans, the Lightning was beloved. Its range allowed it to escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory. Its heavy armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, made it devastatingly effective against enemy fighters and shipping. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace, flew a P-38 and credited its power and reliability with keeping him alive through hundreds of combat missions. In the warm Pacific air, the twin Allisons ran smoothly. The control surfaces remained responsive, and pilots praised the aircraft's ability to absorb damage and bring them home. But in Europe, particularly during high-altitude bomber escort missions over Germany and occupied territories, the P-38 struggled. At heights above 25,000 feet, where Luftwaffe interceptors routinely operated, the Lightning encountered a cascade of cold weather problems that transformed it from a capable fighter into a liability. The issue was not a single flaw, but a system-wide vulnerability to extreme cold that manifested in multiple ways, each potentially fatal. The most critical problem occurred in the cockpit itself. At temperatures that regularly dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, condensation from the pilot's breath would freeze instantly on the inside of the canopy, creating an opaque layer of ice that no amount of scraping could fully clear. Pilots described flying blind for crucial seconds during combat, trying to peer through tiny scratched portholes while German fighters maneuvered for killing shots. The cockpit heating system, designed for more moderate conditions, proved woefully inadequate at stratospheric altitudes. Pilots wore every piece of cold weather gear available: fleece jackets, insulated boots, multiple layers of gloves, and still suffered frostbite on missions lasting more than 2 hours. But the cold penetrated deeper than crew comfort. The P-38's control systems relied on a complex arrangement of cables running through the wings and tail assembly, translating pilot inputs into control surface movements. At extreme altitude, these cables would contract and stiffen, their protective lubricants thickening into semi-solid gels. Pilots reported that aileron response became sluggish, that pulling the aircraft into a tight turn required physical effort that left them exhausted. In combat, where split-second maneuvering meant the difference between life and death, this sluggishness was often fatal. Luftwaffe pilots learned to exploit it, waiting until P-38s reached high altitude before attacking, knowing the American fighters would handle like freight trains while their own Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s retained full agility. The engines presented their own constellation of problems. The Allison V-1710 was a magnificent piece of engineering at sea level, reliable and powerful. But it had been designed before high-altitude strategic bombing became a central doctrine, and its intercooler system proved vulnerable to ice formation. At altitude, moisture in the intake air would freeze in the intercooler radiators, blocking airflow and causing rapid engine overheating despite the freezing external temperatures. Pilots faced the paradoxical nightmare of having engines overheat in conditions cold enough to kill them. Emergency procedures called for throttling back and losing altitude, precisely what a pilot cannot do when German fighters are attacking from above. More insidiously, fuel lines running through unheated sections of the aircraft would experience vapor lock as temperatures dropped. Fuel flow would become erratic, engines would sputter, and pilots would find themselves nursing failing power plants while still deep over enemy territory. Some aircraft lost both engines simultaneously, their pilots forced to glide down through hostile airspace, hoping to reach friendly lines before gravity delivered them to capture or death. The Luftwaffe intelligence services documented these vulnerabilities with Germanic thoroughness. Interrogations of captured P-38 pilots revealed consistent complaints about cold weather performance. Wreckage analysis of shot-down Lightning showed ice formation patterns in control systems and engines. German fighter pilots were briefed to force P-38s to high altitude whenever possible to exploit these known weaknesses. By late 1943, the strategic calculus was clear. For every hour an American heavy bomber raid operated above 25,000 feet, the P-38s assigned to protect them became progressively less effective, while German defenders maintained full capability. The Americans were losing the high-altitude war not through inferior courage or poor tactics, but through the simple physics of heat transfer in a hostile environment. Inside the Lockheed engineering facilities in Burbank, California, a different kind of battle was being waged. Kelly Johnson, the legendary designer who had created the P-38, reviewed field reports with growing frustration. The Lightning was his conception, his vision of what a fighter aircraft should be, and watching it struggle in European combat felt personal. But Johnson was not a man who blamed his creation's failures on the users. If pilots said the aircraft had problems, then it had problems, and problems existed to be solved. The challenge was one of competing constraints. The P-38 was already in mass production, with thousands of aircraft either completed or on assembly lines. Any modification had to be implementable without stopping production, without requiring complete redesign, without adding so much weight that performance suffered in other areas. The solution could not be to build a different aircraft. There was no time for that, and the 8th Air Force needed escort fighters immediately. The solution had to work within the existing airframe, had to be retrofittable to aircraft already in service, and had to be reliable enough to trust lives to in combat. The engineering team examined multiple approaches. Improved insulation was considered but rejected. It added weight and did nothing to address the fundamental problem that at 30,000 feet there is no ambient heat to conserve. More powerful heating systems were designed, but they drew electrical power that the aircraft's generators could barely supply, and they did nothing for control cables running through the wings. Some engineers advocated for sealed, pressurized control systems filled with temperature-stable fluids, but the complexity and weight made that approach impractical for field implementation. The breakthrough came from a principle so basic it seemed almost insulting in its simplicity: resistance heating. Pass electrical current through a conductor with the right properties, and the resistance to that current generates heat. The same principle that makes a toaster glow red could, properly applied, keep control cables and fuel lines warm enough to function at any altitude where humans could survive. But translating principle into practice required solving a cascade of subsidiary problems. The wire had to be thin and flexible enough to wrap around existing cables and route through confined spaces in the wing structure, yet robust enough to withstand the vibration and stress of combat flight. It had to generate consistent heat across its entire length without creating hot spots that could damage surrounding components. It had to operate safely, even if damaged by enemy fire, without creating short circuits or fire hazards. The electrical system had to be upgraded to provide the additional current without compromising other essential systems. And all of this had to be accomplished quickly enough to matter in a war that was killing pilots every day. The solution that emerged was elegant in its execution. Resistance heating wire would be routed through the aircraft in strategic locations, wrapped around control cables throughout the wings and tail, threaded through channels in the fuel system, installed in the strips along the leading edges where ice accumulation was most severe. The system would be controlled by switches in the cockpit, allowing pilots to activate heating as needed at altitude. Power would come from upgraded generators, with the entire electrical system rebalanced to handle the additional load. Total weight increase, less than 50 pounds. Installation time on existing aircraft, approximately 40 hours. Cost, minimal compared to losing aircraft and pilots. The German approach to the same problem revealed a fundamentally different philosophy. Luftwaffe high-altitude fighters were designed around the assumption that cold was an environmental constant that pilots must endure through superior training and willpower. German aviators were conditioned to view physical hardship as character building, as separating the weak from the strong. The concept of engineering away discomfort was seen as softness, as the kind of thinking that would ultimately make warriors dependent on technology rather than strengthening their natural resilience. This was not ignorance. German engineers certainly understood resistance heating and could have implemented similar systems. But the decision to do so would have required acknowledging that perhaps efficiency mattered more than endurance, that perhaps keeping a pilot warm and comfortable actually made him more effective rather than soft. It would have required accepting the American premise that technology should serve human needs rather than humans proving themselves worthy through suffering. In pilot briefings and training documents, the Luftwaffe emphasized cold weather flying as a test of will. Pilots were instructed in breathing techniques to minimize canopy icing from their breath, in meditation-like focus exercises to maintain concentration despite physical discomfort, in the mental discipline required to override the body's natural responses to cold stress. This was framed not as compensating for equipment deficiency, but as cultivating the warrior spirit, as building the kind of mental toughness that would prove decisive in combat. For a time, this approach appeared vindicated by results. German pilots did maintain better high-altitude performance than their early P-38 adversaries. But they achieved this at enormous cost in physical and psychological stress, in reduced mission effectiveness as pilots fought their own bodies as much as the enemy, in training casualties as aviators pushed themselves too far in the frozen sky. The Luftwaffe was winning through human sacrifice, burning through pilots the way a furnace burns coal, extracting performance through suffering that could not be sustained indefinitely. The American wire, prosaic, unglamorous, the product of engineering rather than ideology, represented a different calculation about how to wage war efficiently. The first P-38s with full electrical heating systems arrived in England in early 1944, designated as the P-38J 15LO production variant. Pilots approached them with skepticism born from months of struggling with earlier models. The Lightning had acquired a reputation in the 8th Air Force as a beautiful aircraft that would betray you at altitude. And reputations do not change overnight because engineers install some new wiring. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins was among the first to fly the modified aircraft on a combat mission, a bomber escort deep into Germany, the kind of mission where altitude and endurance were not optional. His squadron climbed to 28,000 feet and settled into formation around a stream of B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails painting white lines across the winter sky. Jenkins reached forward and activated the heating system switches, feeling slightly foolish, expecting nothing more than placebo comfort. What happened over the next 3 hours rewrote his understanding of what a P-38 could do at altitude. The cockpit remained clear, not merely clearer than before, but genuinely transparent, free from the ice that had made high-altitude combat a claustrophobic nightmare of peering through scratched pinholes. Jenkins could see approaching German fighters when they were still specks in the distance, could maintain visual contact throughout combat maneuvers, could check his 6 o'clock without wondering whether that shape in his frozen peripheral vision was an enemy fighter or an ice crystal. The psychological relief of simply being able to see was profound. When the attack came, FW-190s diving from 32,000 feet, the classic Luftwaffe tactic of altitude advantage, Jenkins hauled his P-38 into a hard climbing turn, the kind of violent maneuver that earlier models would have responded to with sluggish reluctance. The Lightning responded instantly, control surfaces crisp and positive, aileron authority unchanged from sea level. He could dogfight, truly dogfight, at heights where he had previously felt like an observer to his own limitations. The engagement lasted 9 minutes of twisting, violent aerial combat. Jenkins stayed with his German adversary through a series of rolls and reversals that would have been impossible weeks earlier, ultimately closing to firing range and sending the Focke-Wulf spinning down trailing smoke. Only when the fight ended and adrenaline began to subside did he realize he was warm. Not comfortable, perhaps, but genuinely warm, his fingers still flexible, his thought processes unclouded by the insidious hypothermia that had previously been an inevitable companion to high-altitude missions. The after-action report he filed was matter-of-fact in the way military documents must be, but his squadron mates remember his words in the debriefing. The damned thing actually works. It's like flying a different aircraft. Across multiple fighter groups, the pattern repeated. P-38 pilots who had learned to dread high-altitude missions discovered they could now operate effectively in conditions that had previously grounded them or made them easy prey. mission effectiveness ratings improved dramatically. Loss rates declined. But more than the statistics, more than the charts showing improved sortie completion, something changed in the pilots themselves. A subtle psychological shift from fighting their own aircraft to trusting it, from managing limitations to exploiting capabilities. German fighter pilots noticed. Intelligence reports from interrogated Luftwaffe aviators began including observations that American P-38s were handling differently at altitude, that the expected sluggishness was no longer reliable. Some German pilots assumed the Americans had introduced a new variant with different engines or control systems. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more significant. The change was wire and current and heat, was the systematic application of engineering to eliminate suffering as a combat variable. The symbolic weight of this transformation extended far beyond tactical aviation. Here was the American way of war made manifest, identifying problems, engineering solutions, refusing to accept that hardship was an unavoidable constant. Where German doctrine celebrated endurance and sought victory through superior will, American doctrine celebrated efficiency and sought victory through superior systems. The heated wire running through P-38 wings was not merely a component, it was a philosophy given physical form, was the industrial democracy's answer to martial ideology. For the young men flying these modified Lightnings, the wire represented something even more personal. It represented an institution that valued their lives enough to spend time and resources keeping them comfortable, that treated their survival as worth engineering effort, that did not confuse suffering with virtue. Every mission in a heated cockpit reinforced the message that they were valuable, that their country wanted them to come home, that efficiency and human welfare were not contradictory values but complementary ones. This was a lesson the Luftwaffe, despite its technical sophistication and tactical brilliance, never fully internalized. German aviators continued to prove their toughness by enduring what they could have engineered away, and they died in frozen cockpits believing themselves superior to the comfortable Americans who killed them. By mid-1944, the P-38's reputation in Europe had undergone a complete reversal. The aircraft that had been seen as a liability in high-altitude combat was now preferred for exactly those missions. Fighter groups that had been transitioning to P-51 Mustangs, a fine aircraft in its own right, sometimes requested to retain their Lightnings instead. The modification's success was measured not just in improved statistics, but in the quiet confidence of pilots who knew their aircraft would not betray them at altitude. The technical cascade that followed the heating system installation revealed how interconnected aircraft systems truly are. With control cables remaining flexible at altitude, pilots could execute more aggressive defensive maneuvers, which meant they survived encounters they would previously have lost. Surviving longer meant accumulating experience faster, which made them more effective in subsequent engagements. Better visibility through clear canopies improved situational awareness, reducing the cognitive load of combat and allowing pilots to make better tactical decisions. Reliable engine performance removed the constant anxiety about mechanical failure, freeing mental bandwidth for fighting rather than systems management. The Luftwaffe attempted to adapt. German intelligence services correctly identified the heating modifications and understood their implications. But by 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was so strained by the cumulative effects of strategic bombing and resource shortages that implementing similar improvements across their fighter force was impossible. Even if the political will had existed to coddle pilots with comfort systems, and within the ideological framework of National Socialism, that will was questionable. The practical means were unavailable. Germany was reduced to fighting the war with the aircraft and doctrine it had, while America continuously improved both. The strategic impact manifested in bomber loss rates. In the winter of 1943-1944, before widespread deployment of heated P-38s, 8th Air Force bombers flying deep penetration raids into Germany experienced loss rates that sometimes exceeded 10% per mission, an unsustainable attrition rate that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. By autumn 1944, with improved P-38s and P-51s providing effective high-altitude escort throughout the mission profile, bomber loss rates had dropped below 2%. The Germans were losing the war in the frozen sky, losing it to heated wire and the philosophy that wire represented. Lieutenant Harrington, the pilot we met in that frozen cockpit over the Adriatic in January, survived the war. He flew 73 combat missions in P-38s, transitioning from the early models to the heated variants. In interviews conducted decades later, he struggled to articulate exactly what the modification meant to him. "It sounds so trivial," he said, complaining about being cold when people were dying. But the cold was killing people. It made us ineffective, made us vulnerable. And then suddenly, we weren't cold anymore, and everything changed. We could fight the Germans instead of fighting the altitude. That sounds simple, but it was everything. His observation captures something essential about technological warfare and the civilization that produces it. The heated wire was simple, was trivial in the way Harrington described, but triviality and significance are not opposites. Sometimes, the most profound changes come from addressing the mundane problems that everyone else has learned to accept as inevitable. The Germans accepted that high-altitude combat meant suffering, built their doctrine around enduring it, and considered that endurance a measure of warrior virtue. The Americans looked at the same suffering and asked whether it was really necessary, whether it served any purpose except to prove toughness, whether solving it might make their pilots more effective. This pattern repeated across countless domains of the American war effort. Where other militaries saw logistical challenges as tests of unit discipline, Americans built the Red Ball Express and Liberty ships. Where others accepted that jungle combat meant malaria and dysentery, Americans deployed massive mosquito control programs and water purification systems. Where others celebrated soldiers' ability to endure poor food, Americans developed field rations that, while never beloved, provided reliable nutrition. The pattern was not about softness or comfort for its own sake. It was about systematic elimination of every obstacle to effectiveness, including obstacles that others had normalized as character-building hardship. The P-38's heated wire was part of this larger pattern, was a single thread in a tapestry of American efficiency that valued results over suffering. And the results spoke clearly. By war's end, Allied air superiority was so complete that German forces moved primarily at night to avoid air attack, that Luftwaffe fighters rarely challenged daylight bomber raids, that the skies belonged to those pilots who had refused to accept cold as an unavoidable constant. The final months of the war saw P-38s ranging far and wide across Europe, their distinctive twin-boom silhouettes a familiar sight from the Channel Coast to Berlin. Pilots who had learned to fly in them developed a deep affection for the Lightning's quirks and capabilities. The heated cockpit, once a novelty, became an expected baseline, the kind of feature that seems obvious only in retrospect. Young pilots arriving at fighter groups in 1945 sometimes didn't know that earlier P-38s had lacked such systems. They assumed all aircraft kept their pilots warm at altitude, because why wouldn't they? This generational amnesia about previous suffering is itself significant. It represents how quickly engineering solutions can transform impossibilities into expectations, how rapidly the abnormal becomes baseline. The wire that had seemed like a miraculous improvement to pilots who had suffered without it became, within months, simply how things were supposed to work. This is the nature of progress. Yesterday's innovation becomes today's standard, and the memory of suffering fades until some historian or veteran reminds us how hard things once were. German pilots, interrogated after surrender, often expressed confusion about American priorities. They had been taught that aerial combat was the ultimate test of individual warrior spirit, that dogfighting at altitude separated the truly exceptional from the merely adequate. The American approach, systematically removing every obstacle to effectiveness, treating pilot comfort as a combat multiplier rather than weakness, seemed to them somehow less pure, less honorable. Some captured Luftwaffe aviators, when shown the heating systems in P-38s, dismissed them as typical American overcomplexity, as evidence that American pilots needed technological crutches that proper warriors could do without. This response revealed how deeply ideology can blind otherwise intelligent people to practical reality. The German pilots making these criticisms had been swept from the skies by those same Americans in their over-complex, heated cockpits. They had proven their toughness and discipline and warrior spirit, and it had not been enough. But acknowledging that comfort and efficiency might actually be superior to suffering and endurance would have required questioning fundamental premises about strength and character. And for many, that psychological threshold was uncrossable even after defeat. The war ended with American air power supreme, with P-38s and P-51s and P-47s operating freely over what remained of the Third Reich. The heated wire had played its small but crucial role in that supremacy, had helped transform the high-altitude environment from German advantage to neutral ground to American domain. When the final statistics were compiled, when historians analyzed the strategic bombing campaign and the air superiority battle, the modification would appear as a footnote, important to specialists, invisible to general readers. This is appropriate. History focuses on the dramatic, the dogfights and bombing raids, the ace pilots and desperate last stands. History does not often celebrate the engineers who eliminated suffering, the wire wrappers who gave pilots clear canopies and warm fingers. But the pilots remembered. In reunions and memoirs, in quiet conversations at VFW halls and aviation museums, the veterans who had flown both heated and unheated P-38s would tell anyone who asked about the difference that wire made. Not in dramatic terms, they had seen too much genuine drama to exaggerate, but in the matter-of-fact way that truth requires no embellishment. The heated cockpit let them do their jobs. It kept them alive. It was, in that simple sense, everything. There is a photograph taken in late 1944 at a fighter base in southern England that captures something essential about this story. The foreground shows a P-38 Lightning being serviced between missions, its cowlings open to expose the complex machinery of its Allison engines. Several ground crewmen are working on the aircraft, their faces blurred by the camera's long exposure. But what makes the photograph remarkable is in the background, a detail so ordinary that most viewers miss it entirely. Coiled on a workbench waiting to be installed during the aircraft's maintenance cycle is a spool of heating wire. It sits among tools and technical manuals, absolutely unremarkable, the kind of component that appears in 10,000 maintenance photographs from the war. The photographer likely didn't notice it, certainly didn't consider it worth highlighting, yet that wire, that unspectacular coil of resistance heating element, represents a victory as genuine as any dogfight, a triumph of problem-solving over acceptance. The Germans had better tactics in 1944, better training in some respects, fighters that were in some ways superior to American designs. They had the advantage of fighting over their own territory, with short supply lines and familiar terrain. They had pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience, men who had survived years of warfare and learned every trick of survival. What they didn't have, what they had philosophically rejected the importance of having, was that wire. They had chosen to believe that warriors should transcend their body's limitations through willpower, that suffering built character, that technology should serve weapon systems rather than human comfort. They had built their entire aerial doctrine around these beliefs, had trained generations of pilots to see cold and exhaustion as tests to be passed rather than problems to be solved. And when they met Americans who had simply decided that freezing in cockpits was inefficient and therefore unnecessary, the ideology proved less durable than engineering. This is not to say that the heated wire won the air war. Such monocausal explanations insult the complexity of history. The Allies won through industrial capacity and numerical superiority and code breaking and tactical innovation and 1,000 other factors large and small. But the wire was part of the pattern, was a thread in the larger tapestry of how democratic industrialism approached warfare differently from fascist militarism. One system believed that war demanded heroic sacrifice and that technology should produce ever more powerful weapons. The other system believed that war demanded efficient victory and that technology should support human effectiveness in every possible way. The Americans wrapped wire around control cables and kept pilots warm, not because they were soft, but because frozen pilots are ineffective pilots. They engineered away suffering not out of weakness but out of the understanding that comfort is a force multiplier, that a pilot who isn't fighting his aircraft can focus entirely on fighting the enemy. This seems obvious now, seems like simple common sense. But it was not obvious then, not to the Germans who built doctrine around endurance, not to the military theorists who confused hardship with virtue. In the decades after the war, as P-38s were retired from service and dispersed to museums and private collections, the heating systems they carried were rarely noted in placard descriptions. Visitors to aviation museums would read about the Lightning's speed and firepower, about the famous pilots who flew it, about its distinctive design and combat record. The wire that kept those pilots alive to become famous, that made that combat record possible, remained invisible, literally wrapped around components inside the wings where no museum visitor would ever see it. This is fitting, perhaps. The greatest engineering achievements are often invisible. Are the solutions so elegant and effective that they disappear into the background of normal function? No one writes odes to the hydraulic systems that keep brakes working or the insulation that keeps houses warm. These things matter enormously, but they matter by their absence. We notice them only when they fail. The heated wire in P-38s mattered by its presence, by eliminating failures that had once been accepted as inevitable. It represents a philosophy of warfare and civilization that sees every obstacle as potentially solvable, that refuses to confuse suffering with necessity, that values effectiveness over ideological purity. These seem like American characteristics, and perhaps they are, but they are not exclusively American. They are the characteristics of any society that takes engineering seriously, that trusts systematic problem-solving over traditional acceptance. What made the heated wire an American innovation was not some unique cultural genius, but rather the institutional willingness to treat pilot comfort as a legitimate engineering priority, to allocate resources to solving problems that didn't involve making weapons more destructive. In the calculus of total war, where every rivet and every weld and every ounce of material might mean the difference between victory and defeat, the Americans decided that keeping pilots warm was worth the weight and complexity and electrical load. The Germans, facing similar constraints, made different choices. History records which approach proved superior. The pilots who flew those heated P-38s, the ones who survived the war and returned to lives as accountants and teachers and factory workers and fathers, carried with them a lesson about how civilization approaches problems. Most probably never articulated it explicitly. It remained an intuitive understanding rather than an intellectual position. But they had lived the difference between a system that demanded endurance of suffering and a system that engineered suffering away. They had experienced viscerally and repeatedly which approach was more effective. When they told their grandchildren about the war, they talked about combat and fear and camaraderie. about the friends who didn't come home and the missions that tested them beyond what they thought possible. They rarely mentioned the heating systems that kept them alive through those missions. But on cold winter days, when age had made them sensitive to temperature in ways their younger selves never were, some of them would remember what it meant to fly at 30,000 feet in a frozen metal shell, and what it meant when someone decided that suffering was unnecessary, and what difference that small kindness made when death was riding the wind at 400 miles per hour. The wire is still there in the preserved P-38s that sit in museums and air shows, still wrapped around control cables in the wings of these retired warriors. Visitors walk past without seeing it, admiring the sleek lines and powerful engines, taking photographs with the distinctive twin-boom silhouette as backdrop. The wire does not call attention to itself. It never did. It simply worked, simply kept pilots warm and aircraft functional, and gave its users the gift of not having to think about it. That is the legacy of the wire trick that made P-38s unbeatable at high altitude. Not fame or dramatic victory, but the quiet competence of problems solved and suffering eliminated and pilots brought home alive. In war, as in peace, the greatest innovations are often the ones that make themselves invisible through the simple act of working perfectly. The heated wire achieved that invisibility and in doing so helped win the frozen sky.